Before the car, the world was, frankly, enormous and a bit rubbish. Getting anywhere was a monumental faff. Imagine you lived in a village and wanted to visit your Aunt Mildred in the next town over. This wasn't a simple 20-minute drive. No, it was an epic undertaking of biblical proportions. Your options were grim. You could walk, which took forever and involved a lot of mud. Your shoes would be ruined, your legs would ache, and by the time you arrived, you'd be too exhausted to even pretend you were happy to see dear old Mildred. It was a terrible way to live, a life lived in a very small box. Your other, slightly more glamorous option was the horse. Now, people get all romantic about horses, don't they? Majestic beasts, wind in your hair, all that nonsense. The reality was much smellier. A horse is not a machine you can just switch off. It needs feeding, watering, and cleaning up after. It gets tired, it can be stubborn, and it has a mind of its own. It's like a furry, four-legged toddler with the power to kick you into next week. Travel by horse-drawn carriage was slow, bumpy, and entirely dependent on the mood of an animal that would rather be eating grass in a field. Then there was the train. The train was brilliant, a proper bit of Victorian engineering, a massive, steaming iron beast that thundered along on rails. The problem? It only went where the rails went. If your destination wasn't near a station, you were out of luck. You'd get off the train and then what? You're back to walking or finding a grumpy man with an even grumpier horse to take you the rest of the way. The train connected the big dots on the map, but it left all the interesting fiddly bits in between completely isolated. It was a solution, but it wasn't the solution. Life was dictated not by your ambition or your desires, but by the sheer difficulty of movement. Your world was your village, or perhaps your town. Journeys were planned for weeks, not minutes. Spontaneity was a luxury nobody could afford. The idea of just popping over to see the coast for an afternoon was utterly ludicrous. It would be like deciding on a Tuesday to pop over to Mars. The world was big, slow, and desperately in need of some proper horsepower, the kind that comes from an engine, not an oat-powered mammal. And then, a spark. Not just a spark from a plug, but a spark of genius in the minds of some magnificent German chaps. In 1886, a man named Carl Benz bolted a small single-cylinder engine onto the back of a three-wheeled contraption. This wasn't a carriage that had lost its horse. This was something entirely new. It was the Benz patent motor wagon, and it was, quite simply, the birth of the car. It was the moment humanity decided it had had enough of horses and their inconvenient digestive systems. This was the big bang of personal freedom, a noisy, smoky, and frankly terrifying revolution on wheels. This first car was not what you would call fast. It had less than 1 horsepower. A modern lawnmower has more grunt. It would struggle to outrun an athletic goose. But speed wasn't the point. The point was that it moved under its own power. It didn't need rails, it didn't need to be fed hay, and it wouldn't stop for a poo in the middle of the road. It was a declaration of independence from the tyranny of biology and the limitations of the railway line. You simply poured some fuel in, fiddled with some levers, and with a cough and a bang, you were the master of your own destiny. Of course, not everyone was impressed. People were scared of these new machines. They were loud, they were smelly, and they broke down. A lot. Imagine the scene. You're clattering down a lane, terrifying chickens and causing horses to bolt, when suddenly there's a sickening crunch and you grind to a halt in a cloud of steam. Out you get, covered in oil, to stare blankly at a collection of metal bits you don't understand. Early motorists weren't just drivers. They were heroic pioneers, mechanics and adventurers, all rolled into one oily package. But despite the breakdowns and the doubters, the idea was just too good to fail. Others saw what Benz had done and thought, I can do that, but better, with more power. Soon, brilliant minds like Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach were building their own versions, strapping engines to four-wheeled carriages. The automobile wasn't just an invention, it was an explosion of possibilities. It was the promise of a world where you could go where you wanted, when you wanted. It was the start of everything we hold dear today: road trips, traffic jams, and arguing about parking. Driving one of these early cars was nothing like hopping into a modern hatchback. There was no key to turn, Oh no, that would be far too simple. Starting the engine was a physical and dangerous ritual. First, you had to fiddle with various taps for fuel and oil. Then you faced the real challenge, the starting handle. You'd slot this huge metal crank into the front of the car and heave with all your might. The engine might roar to life, or it might just kick back, breaking your thumb or your wrist with vicious force. It was a battle of man versus machine before you'd even moved an inch. Once the engine was chugging away, the business of driving began. The controls were a confusing mess of levers and pedals that seemed to have been placed randomly. The steering wasn't a wheel, but a tiller, like on a boat. So you'd sit there, wrestling with this tiller to keep the car pointed vaguely forward, while your feet did a frantic dance on pedals that might be the clutch or the brake or something else entirely. There were no power steering, no anti-lock brakes, and certainly no air conditioning. Every bump in the road was transmitted directly into your spine. These machines were also spectacularly unreliable. A journey of 20 miles was a grand tour fraught with peril. The engine could overheat, the primitive tires could puncture at any moment, and various bits were prone to simply falling off for no reason. Every driver had to be their own mechanic. The toolbox was more important than the luggage. You'd spend half your time driving and the other half lying on your back in a puddle, covered in grease, trying to figure out why the clanking noise had suddenly been replaced by an even more worrying silence. And the weather. There were no roofs, or if you were lucky, a flimsy canvas affair that offered all the protection of a wet paper bag. If it rained, you got wet. If it was sunny, you got burned. If it was cold, you froze. Drivers would wrap themselves in enormous coats, goggles, and gloves, looking like pilots about to cross the Atlantic. It wasn't just a drive, it was an expedition. It was uncomfortable, dangerous, and utterly, brilliantly exhilarating. You weren't just operating a machine, you were taming a wild beast. The arrival of the car didn't just change travel, it completely redrew the map of our lives. Suddenly, the distance between towns and villages began to shrink. The 15-mile journey to the next major market town, once an arduous all-day trek by cart, could now be done in an hour or two. This was revolutionary. It meant you could sell your goods at a different market, visit relatives you hadn't seen in years, or even go to a doctor in a different town. The car was a key that unlocked the world beyond your immediate horizon. This new mobility changed where people could live and work. Before the car, you had to live within walking distance of your job or a train station. But with a car, you could live out in the countryside, away from the smoke and grime of the city, and still drive in for work. This was the birth of the suburb and the commuter. The car gave people the freedom to choose their environment, to have a garden and some fresh air, without sacrificing their livelihood. It broke the iron link between home and workplace that had existed for centuries. And what about leisure? The car invented the weekend trip. The idea of just deciding on a Saturday morning to drive to the seaside or have a picnic in the forest was now a reality. Families could pile into their Ford Model T and set off on an adventure. They could explore their own country, see landscapes they had only ever read about in books, and create memories together. The car turned the map from a boring piece of paper into a catalogue of possibilities, a menu of destinations for fun and exploration. In the end, these ancient, clattering machines did more than just make travel faster. They gave ordinary people a level of freedom and personal control that was previously unimaginable. They empowered individuals, connected communities, and reshaped our entire society. Every time you get in your car today and turn the key, you are completing an act that started with Carl Benz's three-wheeler. You are continuing a story of noise, oil, and the relentless, glorious pursuit of going wherever you want, just because you can. And that is a truly magnificent thing.